Okay, I think it's recording. Okay, awesome. Uh, Hi, everyone. Welcome to our fourth podcast of the year, or first podcast of this year, depending on the way you see it. Today we have Louis McGee, who will be joining us to talk about disability justice today, as well as some of his personal story. But with that, I should introduce myself first. I haven't uh, been on this podcast that often. So just to introduce myself, my name is Kyle, pronouns he or they, and I'm one of the co-advocacy chair for MASU, year 2020-2021. Louis, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, my name is Louis McGee. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the president of the Disabled Student Cultural Center and excited to be on the podcast today.
Yeah. And we both are students at University of Minnesota.
Correct.
Twin
Yes,
City
I'm
here, yeah.
in my sophomore year.
Gotcha. Let's see. Oh, I kind of also want to show the audience our drinks a bit. So,
Oh.
so
Well, Kyle's got me trying something new today. I'm having a avocado smoothie for the first time.
yeah, isn't it amazing? Our other,
It's delicious.
I'm glad you liked it. Our other advocacy chair, Jenny, would usually just eat the avocado straight up. I don't know about you. I thought that's kind of different.
I don't know if I would do that.
Yeah. Just to share the recipe a little bit with the audience, it's essentially just, what was it? It was just smashed avocado, smashed with condensed milk, and then you top it off with milk, and then it's just kind of like a smoothie flavor. Yeah.
Yeah, it's delicious.
But yes, if are any new audience members who don't really know what Ask Avo is, essentially it is a play on word for advocacy. Ask Advocado, Ask Avo. So hence the avocado drinks. But our goal is to make advocacy more accessible. Too many times, I think there is like such a big cancel culture when it comes to advocacy. Like, oh, if you say the wrong thing, if you fuck up, like, oh, you're canceled. Like you are, like they will shut you off. And I don't think it's productive. I don't think like, oh, there's nothing, you can't really learn from that. So I want to set the tone for this podcast. Like we're all learning, we're all students, we're not experts. And we're just here to learn. We're here to have conversations, and it's okay to fuck up. Yeah.
I would agree with that. I feel like along that same note, I do feel like, in the world where we live in a world where everybody's trying to do their part and, if you do it wrong, you're screwed. And so I think this is a great opportunity to kind of teach and learn at the same time of like, it's okay to ask questions. And often that's better than just trying to do the right thing. If you're just asking, then you can find it out.
Exactly. So yes, that is the purpose of the podcast. And this month we'll focus on disability justice. But before that, since you introduced yourself as the president of DSCC, or Disabled Student Cultural Center, essentially one of the, or actually I'll let you do the introductions yourself. What is DSCC?
Yeah. So we're one of the cultural centers here at the University of Minnesota. You can find us on the second floor of the Memorial Union. So our mission is to provide a space for disabled students to interact, collaborate, find like-minded people to have similar conversations, share experiences, and then along the way, do some advocacy. There's, lots of advocacy in all corners of the world, and our mission is to shed light on the disabled community a little bit more. And so we do that in a bunch of different ways, but some ways are, we work together to make each other comfortable, to share experiences and learn from each other. And then also we try and do outreach to the community and, you know, show the able-bodied world what we're all about.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I also just want to like hash out some vocabs. Uh, and able body would be people who do not have disability, or how would you define it?
Correct. You will often hear the terms like able-bodied or neurotypical. Those are kind of the terms thrown around for people who able-bodied, you know, don't have any, you know, physical disabilities. Neurotypical would mean, you know, don't have any neuro disabilities. So pretty much, you know, the same thing. And there's, you know, a gray line between physical disability and, you know, I don't want to, you know, cross any boundaries with that. But yeah, those are kind of the two words to describe people who are not disabled: neurotypical and then able-bodied. So.
Mhm, mhm. I see. So how did you personally get involved as the president of DSCC?
Yeah. So I'm blind. Um, I was diagnosed with a rare eye disease when I was 5 years old. Been losing my vision progressively ever since. And so, you know, growing up with a certain amount of vision, but, you know, I was losing it over time, you know, gave me an appreciation because I was always the only blind person I knew. There's not that many of us. I think there's about 470 school-age blind kids in Minnesota. So we only get to meet each other at, you know, camps and things that, you know, events that the state puts on or whatnot. So I, you know, kind of grew up doing a lot of self-advocacy because I had to. I had to kind of teach the world what I was all about, as I figured what I was all about. Um, and so that kind of, you know, from a young age taught me about advocacy. And I saw all the things in the world that, you know, weren't necessarily set up to help people like me. So, you know, I started getting involved more advocacy in high school. And then, you know, I became a student here at the University of Minnesota last year. And about halfway through the year, I found out about the DSCC, and I was excited to see what I could do to help. And so I've been involved for a little over 2 semesters now. So it's been great work, but yeah, I'm excited to do more advocacy in disabilities in general now. So, you know, up until I joined the DSCC, I would say for me, I can only speak from the experience of a blind person. And so, I mean, I still only can, obviously, but I'm excited to hear more perspectives in the disability community and learn more and, you know, and have all these dynamic perspectives, you know, near me. And so now I feel like I can, you know, I'm learning a lot and it's really exciting.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I thank you for sharing. And what would you say that are some of your, what would be some of the examples of the work that you have done at DSCC?
Yeah. So you know, we've been living with the pandemic for a while, so things have been a bit slow recently. But back last year in the spring, we before the pandemic hit, we had some really exciting meetings. This was around the time I was starting at the DSCC. We had some really exciting meetings with Spin and Lime, some of the, if you remember, the e-scooter companies. Haven't seen them for a while because of the pandemic. They put out far fewer scooters this summer. But we had met with them to kind of discuss some, you know, accommodations with, you know, scooters being left all over the place. You know, it's inaccessible for wheelchair users or someone like me. If I'm walking down the street, all of a sudden I run into a scooter, you know, we had some really exciting discussions with them about changing that. That was one project I was super excited about. That, you know, it was going places and the pandemic hit and they didn't bring the scooters back out. So I suppose we got what we wanted in the long run. So that was exciting. But other things we do, you know, we've had events like Caffeine Connections where, you know, back when we could, we would, you know, go into our space at the union and have some coffee, have some discussions, you know, things like talking about, you know, justice, autism justice, or, you know, what it's like to have, you know, be dealing with more than one disability at the same time, some of that intersectionality in the disabled community. And so, we try and get a variety of things, reach out and, get a wider audience. But the trouble, recently has been, we have a small, it's hard to reach people during a pandemic. So, we're looking forward to the future in the spring and bringing people together and working with other groups and kind of bringing the disabled voice into some other conversations.
Mm-hmm. And I hear you use like terms like intersectionality and like identities, and like all of this, like the way you describe disabled community, it seems like it's almost like a culture. Is that how it could it be described like that?
Yeah, I mean, we are the Disabled Student Cultural Center. It's pretty exciting. Actually, University of Minnesota. We were actually the first university to have a cultural center. So we're the first university to recognize that the disabled community has its own culture. It is it's a culture in its own way, and however you define culture, humanity and society has invented things like this over time. So, but it's pretty exciting that we're recognized as a culture.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for me personally, it's also very new to me that, or at least it never occurs to me that it's a culture. There's identities that matters to people and intersectionality. So how, or what's the question? So like, why do you think it hasn't been widely recognized as like a culture?
Yeah. Well, and that's not necessarily the goal, but I do think the reason it's not been widely recognized is mostly just the conversations we have around disabilities. No one likes to have them. Like, let's just be honest. It's really hard to have those discussions because people feel awkward and people feel like they don't know what to say or how to ask it, so they don't, or they avoid it. And so that's sort of the thing that we're fighting against is let's have these conversations. They're tough conversations in some cases, but we got to have them. They exist. A really high percent of people are disabled. Like 20%, I think, of the adult population, lives with a disability day to day. So why are we not confronting it as much as we're confronting other things? And it's hard because how do you have a conversation that people don't want to have? It becomes difficult even on our own side. We're having conversations with ourselves, trying to figure things out along the way. It's sad that it's sort of a new thing and not really talked about, but that's where we're at, and we're trying to push that forward.
And here we are with the podcast.
Here we are. I'm lucky to be on here having this discussion.
Yeah. And so when that makes sense. Like, I think like when you said like that does also show up in lots of sorry, I'm just drawing my own personal experience to kind of make sense of this, but
go ahead.
It makes sense. Like, I think like in Asian American community, there's like a lot of things other people try not to approach because of trying to be correct, because of stuff like that. And so there's always stuff that people don't know, people are too afraid to ask, and they end up doing harm. They end up like accidentally, unknowingly did some type of harm against that community. So with that, I kind of want to ask, what are some common things that you see in our society that still perpetuate some type of ableism against disabled people, just because those conversations are not being had?
Yeah. So I would say that probably the biggest thing is, if we're not willing to have these conversations, like, we're not going to get anywhere, right? And so it's hard to combat awkwardness because, when you have those conversations, like, people, it's hard to find the right way to approach a conversation where someone's going to have to feel awkward the whole time, but then how do you make them come away with a better understanding and with a better curiosity to continue. You know, I feel like curiosity is what we need, right? We need people to want to learn and want to understand. And so in society, a lot of the problems we run into are, you know, things like in school, you know, obviously Brown versus Board of Education, there's no such thing as school segregation anymore. Okay, well, if the listeners out there, like if you went to, you know, a public high school, chances are pretty good you saw a different room that wasn't the standard classroom where disabled kids went for maybe special ed, or, you know, they had to be taken out of the regular classroom so that they could, you know, learn differently. You know, our society is not set up to be all inclusive. It's set up so that we have one way of doing things, and if someone needs special accommodations, they gotta get out of there, and they gotta, you know, have those special accommodations somewhere else. Well, imagine what it's like for kids growing up in public school. You know, you're only in a classroom with 3 or 4 other kids. You know, you don't get to have the same experiences. You don't get to, you know, meet, you know, for me, if I was the only blind kid I knew, that's probably how it's going to be in the adult life. You know, it's not going to be, you're not going to get a job and then be in your special ed, you know, office room at work, right? You know, you gotta, people need to interact with with real society. You know, we can't separate kids like that. So I would say that's one of the big issues. Another big issue that we don't, you know, talk about a lot is, you know, police brutality. That has a big impact on the disabled community. Half of all violence related with police is disabled. We don't, you know, often the disabled boy, excuse me, the disabled voice just gets shunted to the side, you know, and not that, you know, anything is more important than anything else, but, you know, why is it pushed to the side? You know, we just don't want to talk about it. And that's hard. And, you know, some intersectionality with like gender and race, you know, just going to be blunt, we all have, you know, stereotypes in our head because our society is racist and ableist and all these things. So, you know, if you think in your head right now of all the stereotypes you have of disabled people, chances are pretty good all the stereotypes in your head are white kids. You know, like you don't really think about minority races in like being also disabled. You know, things like race and you know, disability and things like that are often just lumped into one category. Like you can be Black or you can be disabled, but you can't be both. Or you can be Asian and you can be disabled, but you can't be both. You know, and some of that's hard as a society. You know, particularly with women. I know in the autism community, there's a big, you know, conversation about it. There's a big like controversy with autistic women. There's a super high suicide rate with autistic women because they don't get services and they don't get accommodations what they need compared to their male counterparts. You know, and it brings their life expectancy way down, and so that's really hard. And you know, it's hard to have a bunch of strong identities, you know, because people want to simplify things and people want to see you for one identity. You know, it's hard to have a lot going on, right? It's hard to be a woman and disabled, or it's hard to be Black and autistic or whatever, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is a fantastic point. You are on spot on how, because personally for me, when I do think of like disabled community, the first mental picture that does pop out in my head are white disabled community, I should say. And yeah, it never occurs, or it does. Let me re-say this. Like it makes sense. Like there are women and there are Asians, there are Apitas, there are Black people, and there are also disabled identities who intersects, but the default it just never occurs. So you were on spot right there, and that is really tragic. How it can lead to life-threatening issues too. Like the
Yeah, it's hard because society tells us these things, right? You know, and we might think, and listeners, you know, eventually if you're hearing this and you might, you know, visualize a white disabled person in your head and you might think, oh man, am I ableist? I mean, our society is. We were taught that. You know, I was taught that as a disabled person. You know what I mean? Like we are taught that, and it's hard because, you know, similar to racism, you can't remain complacent. You have to fight back. You need to like learn what is happening and combat it. You can't remain complicit. You know, it's sort of like uh, you know, you have to be in it. I would say there's a parallel with the racism community. You know, we obviously cannot say there's no race. Like there's only one race, the human race. All right, well that's stupid. There are races, and we made them. You know, humans created these, you know, groups so that they could, you know, level themselves on a scale and rate themselves against each other. We created that, and now we're reaping the problems of that. And so we can't just ignore it now. We have to fight back and go back and change it, right? Just like we told the world, you know, all these past, you know, hundreds of years, we've told the world that disabled people are less than able-bodied people. And so now we can't just say, oh, they're not. We have to fight back and, you know, push back at those things and the things that are set up in society that make it so that everybody thinks, you know, you're less, or you can only be disabled and white and male and, you know, have nothing else going on. Like there's all these you know, the world isn't quite so simple.
Yeah, 100%. I personally get kind of frustrated, like whenever someone's like, "Oh, racism doesn't exist." My uncle personally told me that this was after Floyd passed, but my family, who are conservative, basically told me, "Oh, just move on." Like, "Oh, it's not a thing. Racism is not a thing. It's just I don't know." But yeah,
Yeah, and
that
you know,
argues it.
we're told that. That's what we're told, right?
Mhm.
Like we are told that, oh, it's 2021. That's all in the past. You know, like the civil rights movement was in the 60s. Like, you know, we solved all those issues. Well, there's a lot more going on in today's world that, you know, disadvantages some people and advantages others, you know, and we have to recognize that. And we have to use, you know, use that as a tool and say, look, this is still happening. And there may be such things as the ADA, you know, the Americans with Disabilities Act, you know, and people might say like, oh, well, now the whole world is accessible.
Mm.
No, it's not, you know, and we need to understand that the world is not set up to be all inclusive because that would be too hard. You know, I'm doing air quotes for the listeners. You know, it's sort of like we're trained to say, what's the easiest route and ask no more questions than that.
100%. Yeah. This this part of the conversation kind of reminds me of this one study that or not a study, but it was like a review or reflection or whatever. But it's essentially saying that like most of um, the medication recommendations or the calorie intakes that you would typically find on the back of like food products or stuff like that, all of those just like dietary or health or medication recommendations, they are all designed to benefit the straight white man, the straight white able-bodied man, and it never like really considers like the like women. It doesn't consider a PETA people and how different their body functions, black people, black bodies, and stuff like that. And so because of that, there are cases of like people going overdose on those like medications and stuff like that. And it's a intersectionality is not often talked about, but it in some cases it's very much like a life-threatening issue. But that just reminds me of that study. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy what you know, what's just looked past today. You know, all these, there's so many things, you know, you can read endless articles and think, oh my God, how is that still happening? And it is,
Mhm,
and we got to do something about it.
mhm, mhm. And now I kind of want to, great discussion, by the way. I love the conversation, but I want to bring it back a little bit to disability justice. And my next question is, why do you think our society has grown to use or to use disabilities as an insult to one another?
Yeah. So there's a lot of, historical things you can look back, in legislation and society and, whatever, and not even that long ago in history. But, you know, I would say the main, I would say like the main struggle is, so when you're disabled, or at least, okay, so for me, I'll use myself as an example. So I'm blind, and in school, I obviously have to learn a little bit differently than sighted people, right? I have to listen to things. I have to, mostly audio, right? Or if it's a visual, it needs to be really big. Things need to be different. So those are accommodations, right? So in school, I needed a lot of accommodations. Well, accommodations often are unfamiliar to people. So in a school that's never taught a blind kid before, they had to learn all these new things. They had to learn how to use technology so that I could use the technology. They had to, provide me with technology. They had to do all these things, right? And I was fortunate to have a school that was willing to do all that. And that's awesome. But, if we, beyond into society, you know, for instance, accommodations in the classroom, we often think that's where it ends. But if I need accommodations in the classroom, chances are I'm going to be living my life also, different than an able-bodied person, right? And so that's what becomes tricky, where people are not willing. Some people are, there's always exceptions. I don't want to make too big of generalizations, but um, too many people are not willing to figure out those accommodations and learn how to, do them or use them or, work with them, right? And so people just become afraid or nervous or awkward because if I walk into a room with my white cane and people see that, I'm sort of instantly putting myself in this blind box. Everybody thinks, all right, he's blind, like we're gonna have to do things differently, we're gonna have to help, we're gonna have to whatever. But they don't necessarily, if they've never met a blind person, they don't know what to do. So often people resort to feeling awkward or asking stupid questions or whatever, right? And so you have to learn all these new things because the disabled community is so diverse. There's so many different disabilities and none of them look the same. And, even across the same disability, they look different, right? There's all different kinds of blindness. And blindness can also be, alongside hearing loss or a cognitive impairment or whatever. There's all these things. And I read this great article once, and I feel bad I'm forgetting the author right now, but it kind of goes along with this vibe of the woman writing the article says, she thinks she has a physical impairment and society gives her a disability by not being accessible, right? And I really like that I would say I have a physical impairment. My eyes don't work the way that your eyes work, but society gives me a disability by not being accessible. So I have to do all these things and I have to do things, I always am going to have to do things differently because I can't see, but I sometimes can't do things because society wasn't created to help me succeed, and that's, in all types of, wheelchair users, for instance, there's a million buildings that you just can't access, right? And, using a wheelchair, that, like that's a physical impairment. Maybe you're paralyzed from the waist down and maybe your legs don't work. So you have a physical impairment, but it didn't become a disability until society didn't create itself to accommodate you. And so it's hard because, people think it's a lot of work or it's awkward or it's they don't want to do it. It's extra work, right? People want to be lazy. And so, here we are struggling along with all of these, we'll just shunt disabled people into the corner, and we'll, help, provide social security because they, can't do a job, or, all these things. And we're not willing to like give them the right accommodations they need so that they can succeed and they can provide just like anybody else.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I that's that added a perspective for me. I think like in so many cases I have heard, it's always about in the PETA community, it's always about like, oh, you should, oh, like you are suffering in a low income family. Oh, okay, just work harder and you'll get there. It's always the person's fault, or it's always the person's misfortune and that they have to overcome. And it's never about how, it's never the question about like, it's always like, oh, why don't you work harder? It's always about like, oh, why? It's never like, why does this happen in the first place? Why can't society like reframe the framework?
Well, you're right.
That's a really big parallel I drew there. So yeah.
Yeah, no, you're right. And it's sort of like, it's sort of like everyone doesn't start out, if life is a race, we live in a capitalist society. So we're, it's all about working, right? That's how you get to the top or whatever. We don't all start at the same starting line, right? Some people start a few steps back. Some people start a few miles back, right? It's not an equal level playing field. So we can't just tell people to work harder or do better or be a better self-advocate. There's different people out there.
Mm-hmm.
There's introverts and extroverts. So the extroverts are, probably better at self-advocacy, and the introverts aren't. But do they, if you're an introvert and disabled, like, are you gonna just, get screwed over because you're not great at, telling people what you can and can't do, or how you need to do things differently? And we screw people over because we're not willing to sort of, put effort back, right? You put it all on the people. And if society is set up like this and it's all on people, some will say, oh, well, what about, the famous like blind guy who climbed Mount Everest, or, the first, paraplegic who climbed Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa. There's these people you can point to, and then you're like, well, you got to take a look at their life circumstances, right? Everyone does not start on the same playing field.
100%. That kind of makes me think, or this is kind of a tangent, a very big tangent, but I had a thought, like before I moved to America in eighth grade, but before I moved to America, I knew I wasn't Asian, but it never clicked. Like it's until after I moved here, experienced some bad things, and then it clicks, like, oh, I'm Asian American. I'm curious to, like, did you ever have that moment that you kind of realize like that is your identity, disabled?
Yes. So as I mentioned, in school, I had to do things, differently. I needed some assistive technology, and, I'm lucky to, it's a great time to be blind. There's a ton of technology out there to help me, right? Mm-hmm. So I remember in the early years, grades, I think it was fourth grade, I had this thing called a CCTV, a closed circuit TV. It was basically a TV monitor with a camera on an arm, and I could point that camera down at my desk, and then on the screen, I could adjust and zoom in really big on all my books and worksheets and all that. So I could do my schoolwork on the screen, and I could move it around and write, and it would be blown up really big. And so that was hard for me because, kids, firstly, kids thought it was awesome. We could, put things under it and blow it up really big. It became I was the cool guy for a while.
Nice.
But then, it became this like, oh, I'm different. I remember one time my screen faced the door to the classroom. And so when kids would walk by in the hallway, I remember seeing these kids, looking in through the window and being like, oh, whoa, what is that? And I kind of, that was, from a young age, I kind of realized like, man, I really do have to learn differently. And I don't feel like, I never felt like I was less, or I had to, the way I learned was maybe less than other kids, but it really made me kind of recognize that, I am different, and I gotta learn to live with that, and I gotta learn to use that as a tool, and I can't let that define me, but at the same time, it does, right? Where's the right balance between, my identity as a blind person, and then where do I draw the line with stopping it to define, all of me? Like, I'm a lot of things. I'm not just blind. And so you kind of gotta realize the balance, and that's been, I would say I'm still not there. It's a learning curve, right? And just like with any identity, you don't. It's a spectrum, and it changes and it evolves over time. But it's a struggle of a conversation you got to have with yourself.
I agree. And that with that, I recently came across what is it called? I recently came across this conversation, and it was recent too. I think it was recent, but it was about how the media coverage of the disabled community is not always the best way, not always the most productive way. As in, like, it describes how in movies you see like a disabled character, and then they overcome all of their struggles to become a quote unquote normal person. What is your opinion in media coverage in general of the disabled community?
Yeah, so I always point, or I use this like this analogy. So I call it like the helpless or the hero, right? So if you're disabled, you're either helpless or you're a hero in anything you do. So like I'm walking across the street with my white cane, someone will run up, oh, that you're just so inspirational. I just walked across the street. That's not cool. Like, there's nothing special about that, right? And then on the other hand, I've been walking across the street and had someone run up to me, grab my cane, and start dragging me along. I'm like,
oh,
you really think that's helpful? Like, I got here without you, right? Like, I don't all of the sudden need your help, right? And so people don't know. And you're right. In media coverage always covers stories like, hey, look at this kid with a huge struggle, and then he overcame it, and it's like, oh, now he's like all better, right? Like maybe he was blind, but he played soccer and then he scored a goal. Like, wow, isn't that amazing? We're sort of portrayed like we were helpless, and then if we overcame like anything, even if it isn't overcoming, if it's walking across the street, that's not really anything at all, but it's portrayed as, look, this person that society says can't do anything just did something, so we need to recognize that and tell them it's awesome. Like every time I do something, it's not inspirational, and and that becomes obvious if you have a close friend. My close friends, they forget I'm blind, right? We just do everything, accommodations just sort of fall into normal life, right? But if you don't have a close friend who's blind, or a close autistic friend or whatever, those things don't, they don't affect you. They don't happen. You don't have to really deal with them. And so then when you come into contact with someone, you don't want to change your ways.
I see. And I just have one last question for you. Unless there's anything else you wanted to expand or add on to whatever we have talked about. But what is a message that you would like to send to our audience who are interested in learning more about disability justice?
Yeah, I would say, as far as disability justice, I would say, um, for me, it's just about asking questions. So every time you're in a situation, um, and there might be, you know, a disabled person or whatever. Like if there's a disabled person you're run into, you know, you have a conversation with, you know,
Mhm.
I would say ask them about it. Don't, you know, don't be rude, you know, obviously like use discretion, obviously, but I would say, you know, for me, I love talking about it. You know, some people are not going to want to talk about it, but that's, you know, that's personal preference. But, you know, if I'm walking down the street, you know, or if I'm in a class, let's say I'm in a class, you know, and people know I'm blind and, you know, we're in like a small group doing an activity or something, you know, when someone has a question like, hey, you know, I know you're blind. Like, I was just wondering, you know, so how do you read the textbook? You know, I'm so excited to answer that question because I'm like, man, this person wants to learn, right? This person knows that I do it differently and they want to know, right? So I love that. I love that interaction. And you know, I can't speak for everybody, but you know, the more curiosity you show, the better. And I would
Mhm.
say, you know, go out there, read some articles, you know, do whatever you want, but you know, don't forget about us, right? Keep us in the back of your head. So you know, we're out here.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. That's good. And I think like just one tiny follow-up, but asking questions definitely a very productive thing. Earlier you mentioned like since people don't really know or if people are afraid to ask, they end up like saying stupid things or saying like or asking stupid questions. What would be some examples of that?
Well, um, I don't know if I can come up with too many like stupid questions, and I don't want to. I feel bad. I maybe said stupid questions. I would rather have a question than not, right? I would
Mm.
rather answer a question. You know, for me, you know, stupid questions that I've had are, you know, like how do you know, like how do you know what clothes you're putting on in the morning, or you know,
Mm.
things like how do you, I don't know, like how do you type? You know, it's things like that. Like, okay, just think about it for like a few more seconds before you ask, right? Like, and it's I'd rather have the curiosity. I'd rather explain it than not. But it's more about the curiosity, right? You know,
Mm.
and it's all, you know, please use discretion. It's all about what people are comfortable with, whoever you're talking to. But if they're willing, you know, if they're willing to talk about their disability, then then take advantage of that and ask questions and have discussions and learn, right? You know, that's what it's all about. You know, I don't know everything about anything, and so you know, I want to learn, right? Like we all should kind of have this vibe of like we don't know, I'm here talking about disabilities, and I'm, you know, the president of the DSCC, but I for sure, you know, I'm learning. I'm at the lower levels. You know, I've got a ton to learn, and having this conversation with you is even now teaching me things, right? You know, you've brought up some points that, you know, I haven't thought about, and you know, I'm as I talk, you know, stuff sort of solidifies in my head differently, and you know, we all kind of just have to recognize that we're sort of continuous students, right?
Mhm.
That's what we just kind of have to look inward and realize that if you got the curiosity, if you have the right intentions, like you're going places.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. I also want to end with just like kind of what you said, like it was this was like a nice moment of reflection for me as well, and I was able to draw like many parallel lines between um, I wouldn't not between the APITA community, but like the APITA community that I grew up in, um, draw parallel lines with your experiences. So I thought that was really cool, and I think that if society takes a moment to also reflect on like the similarities, like the similar, not like the same struggle, but like the similar struggle, the patterns of the struggle that happens, I think like it would probably bring lots of unity more than like awkward conversations and division. But yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's all I have for the podcast. Any lasting words?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to share this, and I hope people take some things away. Don't think I'm crazy or anything, but I'm really excited to have this discussion. It's a discussion that needs to continue. So yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much.